Across medieval Europe, adultery was not merely a personal matter, it was a legal and social crisis that threatened lineage property and the delicate balance of community honor. When a woman was suspected or accused of infidelity, she entered a system of punishment shaped by laws that were written to protect inheritance and maintain order. The punishments were real, documented, and carried out in ways that left permanent marks on the lives of those judged guilty. To understand their severity, one must examine not only what the law prescribed, but how these punishments were performed publicly and privately across the continent. The process began long before sentencing. Accusation alone carried weight. Medieval law relied on reputation and testimony more than physical evidence. Neighbors served as witnesses. Gossip could become legal proof. When an accusation was raised, the woman was summoned before a court. In England and much of France, church courts handled these cases. In Germany, Italy, and Iberia, municipal or regional courts often shared authority. The hearing itself followed a predictable structure. The accused stood before clerics or magistrates and answered questions designed to test consistency. Witnesses were called. Their statements were recorded in Latin or in the local vernacular by scribes who preserved the tone of the community. Once judgment was given, the punishment began. The details of those punishments survive in legal codes, civic statutes, chronicle entries, and monastic registers that allow us to reconstruct exactly what happened. Public penance was the baseline punishment throughout Western Europe. These rituals were not symbolic gestures, they were tightly structured ceremonies intended to shame the offender before the entire parish. On designated Sundays, a woman judged guilty stood outside the church doors barefoot and dressed in simple wool or linen, usually white or grey. Sometimes she held a candle, sometimes she wore a veil that had been darkened or stained to mark disgrace. As parishioners arrived, she waited in silence. When the priest stepped outside, he announced her offense to the congregation. In some towns, the woman repeated her confession aloud. The community watched her without speaking. The ritual created a break between her old life and the life she would now be forced to rebuild under a cloud of shame. In some regions, such as Normandy or Flanders, the woman then walked behind the priest into the church and sat in a designated place visible to all. These events were not intended to harm but to destroy reputation. Medieval society treated reputation as currency. Once lost, it rarely returned. Canon law also allowed bishops to impose stricter penances. Some women were ordered to fast for long periods. Others were placed under supervision of local nuns for weeks or months. Monastic registers describe women assigned to carry water sweep cloisters or assist in kitchens as part of penitential discipline. These were not imprisonments, but they removed the woman from her home and signaled that she was under correction. Secular punishments were often harsher and more public. In France, the coutumes local law codes detail specific procedures. A woman found guilty might be removed from her home by town officials. The husband did not carry out this act, the town did. 2 officers, usually sergeants or beadles, escorted her through the street. In some towns, she walked behind a banner used for judicial processions. The symbolism was clear. She was under the authority of the community. Once she reached the boundary, she was ordered not to return. Exile meant immediate displacement. There was no time to collect belongings. She relied on relatives or charity for survival. Those who had no support often wandered to nearby towns, hoping the stigma did not follow them, though usually it did. German law codes, such as the Sachsenspiegel, describe punishments that were ritualistic and precise. When a woman was sentenced to shaming, she was brought to the market square by town guards. Before the crowd, a barber cut her hair evenly across the scalp. Chroniclers note that this was done with ceremony, not violence. The act stripped her of honor in a culture where hair symbolized status. Once shorn, she was led slowly around the market so every trader and citizen could see her. No one touched her. No one spoke to her. The silence was intentional. It was designed to isolate and brand her. Italian city statutes from Florence, Siena, and Bologna describe ceremonies even more structured. The woman sat on what was called the stone of penance, usually a low block in a central location, such as near a fountain or at the main gate. Officials stood on each side. A herald announced her sentence aloud. Crowds gathered not to jeer, but to witness. Civic governments believed that crime threatened the whole city, and that visibility restored order. Once the announcement was made, she remained seated for a fixed period, often an hour, sometimes longer. Afterward, she was escorted away without ceremony. Her name entered the civic register and remained there. Among the aristocracy, punishment was more controlled but frequently more severe. Noble women were rarely subjected to public humiliation because their status made spectacle politically risky. Instead, punishment took the form of confinement. Chronicles record many such cases. A noble woman accused of infidelity might be taken to a family tower or a fortified residence where she was kept under guard. She could not leave. She could not communicate with allies unless her family permitted it. Servants watched her movements. Her personal possessions were removed. She lived under strict routine, sometimes for years. Monastic confinement was equally restrictive. Noble women placed in convents lived under religious discipline regardless of personal belief. Their days were structured by bells, prayers, and silence. They were not prisoners legally, but in practice they had no freedom. Another punishment that appears frequently in legal documents was the loss of dowry. Dowry represented a woman's economic security. If she was judged guilty, the dowry could be seized by her husband or her husband's family. Court registers from Paris and the Parlement of Toulouse include cases where entire estates changed ownership because of adultery. A woman stripped of her dowry had little chance of rebuilding her life. She could not remarry with honor. She could not provide for herself. She became dependent on relatives who sometimes refused support because of fear of scandal. Community-driven punishments also shaped the fate of many women. Manor court rolls from England show villagers imposing additional consequences beyond formal sentences. Some forced the woman to stand at the center of the village green while neighbors formed a circle around her. The ritual varied, but always centered on public acknowledgement. The woman was required to apologize to the community and to her husband if reconciliation was intended. The assembly then voted on whether she could remain in the village. These decisions were recorded by the steward and legally binding. One practice found in rural France and parts of the Low Countries required the woman to carry a heavy stone through the main street, symbolizing the burden of her offense. She walked slowly while villagers watched. The act was not intended to harm physically, but to imprint the memory of the offense on the community's collective mind. Medieval law also shaped what happened after sentencing. A woman judged guilty lost guardianship of her children in many regions. The church accepted the principle that a husband had the right to protect lineage. Once guardianship transferred, it usually remained with the husband permanently. Some women attempted appeals through bishops' courts, but the records show little success. Once reputation had collapsed, the system rarely reversed judgment. The legal consequences could extend long after the event. Inheritance disputes decades later sometimes referenced an ancestral accusation of adultery. Property claims were denied, titles were challenged, family reputations were shaped by judgments handed down long before. What is striking in all these sources is the precision. Medieval punishment was not chaotic. It followed procedures and rituals designed to reinforce social order. Each step communicated authority. Each act reminded the community of its shared values. Executions for adultery did occur in medieval Europe, but they were exceptional and tied to specific political or frontier contexts. They were rare enough that chroniclers wrote about them because they were unusual, not typical. The true brutality lay not in physical harm, but in the destruction of social identity. Medieval society believed that reputation was the foundation of life. Once broken, it could not be restored. The fate of a woman accused of infidelity in medieval Europe was therefore not a moment, but a transformation. Once judged guilty, she became someone the community no longer trusted. Her social world narrowed, her rights diminished, her future collapsed. She lived under the weight of punishment not for a day or a week, but often for the remainder of her life. What do these punishments reveal about a society where order was preserved not through violence, but through humiliation, confinement, and the deliberate destruction of reputation? For more history drawn directly from the records, stay curious with the channel and continue exploring the truths that time tried to bury.